Good evening. Sorry for being a minute or two late. We are ready to go with our introduction to herbs to get you all up and running, playing around with some herbs for your horses. So herbs have been around for forever, really, as medicines. And horses are natural herbivores. That's what their digestive tract is. Their digestive tract is totally adapted to the plant material and to eating plant material. That's what they really are made for. And it looks like there's a couple people that have had trouble getting started. I'm seeing some chats. Is everybody able to hear now? Okay, so we'll start over. Horses are natural herbivores. Their digestive system is totally adapted to plant material. They graze on all kinds of plants, and if you wander around your barnyard, what you'll find out is that there are more herbs in your barnyard than you can believe. So the horse is designed to eat those herbs, and they can eat them pretty well whole because they can digest the cellulose, which we as humans cannot so much. That's very useful because feeding raw herbs or whole herbs is the easiest and the cheapest way to get herbs into horses. So we can grind up the herbs into powders if we're using roots. We can use whole flowers. We can use parts of leaves. Anything that's thick and stemmy, we can grind up and make into a bit of a powder. Otherwise, the horses are quite capable of eating it. When we want to feed herbs, very often we can start with a small dose, let the horses get used to it. And what's really interesting is that horses they often know when an herb is the right thing for them. So if you go to give your horse herbs and they absolutely refuse to eat it, pay attention to that. Maybe it's not the right herb for that horse. And if they really, really like it, lots of times they will clean up their food with it and look for more. If the horse really likes it, you don't have to start out with a small dose. You can start out with a full dose. If they're having a little trouble getting used to it, you can mix it up with their food. Unsweetened applesauce makes a good mixer. A little bit of wet beet pulp or wet Timothy. Timothy cubes or Timothy pellets very often work if you're not feeding any grains. If your horses can tolerate having a little bit of honey, you can add that. You can mix it with apple cider vinegar. And there are actually a number of companies that I use that use apple cider vinegar with just a little bit of honey as a sweetener, as a base for a liquid herbal formula. And you can also mix it with some low-carb sweeteners. I like yacon syrup, which is an interesting syrup that is definitely a low carb, whereas agave gets a lot of publicity as a low carb sugar, but it's actually not. Behaves just like fructose. So what would be some doses that we would use? What we would be doing is we want to give, in general, about 2 to 4 times the human dose. The truth is that horses are very sensitive to herbs. So you look at this 1,200-pound animal and you think that they need, 10 times as much as a human. That's not true at all. In many cases, I actually end up with horses on a maintenance dose that's no more than a human dose. They're very efficient at processing herbs. So around 20 to 30 grams per day is an approximate dose. If you have like flowers and leaves, and they're mostly they're not ground into a powder, that could be about a handful of these flowers. If you have a powder or a root, that might be 1 tablespoon of that twice a day, or 2 tablespoons total for the day. In general, I like to feed it twice a day and divide the dose in half, but if you're only feeding horses once a day, they can certainly have their entire dose at one time. One of the things that we have to pay attention to with herbs is that the responses can be a little bit slow, and we get so used to wanting instantaneous responses, but herbs are very gentle, they're very safe medicines, but they take a little bit of patience and a little bit of time. So in general, you're looking at feeding an herb for 2 to 6 weeks before you might decide that it's not helping at all. The more chronic the condition, the longer you want to give it before you decide that it's not the right thing. And there's a couple of herbs that we'll go through that you would just use for a short period of time. You can, if you have access to your horse 3 times a day and you really are looking for a faster response, you can actually dose them 3 times a day. The liquid tinctures and the extracts, the concentrated extracts, have a tendency to act faster because they actually have more of the herb material in them. It's just been extracted out. So again, a lot of times you might want to start with a liquid, little bit more concentrated form of a formula, and then go to a more into a powder or a whole herb type of formula. The Hilton Herb Company, I use a lot of their herbs, and they often have a liquid and a powder. So you start out with a liquid, and then you can move on to the maintenance as a powder or as just the whole herbs. The extracts, the liquids, again, it's sort of 2 to 4 times the human dose. And that can be variable depending on the concentration. So if you go into your health food store, you may see liquid herbs, like a liquid concentrate of milk thistle. And you go, well, how do I know how much to give? Well, the dose is about 2 to 4 times the human dose. And that often ends up being 90 to 120 drops of the tinctures. So you can count that out the first time or two, and then you see how full you have to make your dropper. You don't have to count out 90 drops every time. If you get 90 one time, 95 one time, 100 one time, and 85 one time, that's going to be fine. So don't make yourself crazy. If you're using extract granules, which is a common way that we get Chinese herbs, those are concentrated, and you're usually looking at anywhere really from 2 to 4 teaspoons of those. And I truthfully find most of the horses do well at 2 teaspoons, 1 to 2 teaspoons twice a day. One of the things when we're looking at our responses to the herbs is that we need a healthy digestive tract to digest the herbs. So sometimes if they're not responding as well as you might think, what you actually need to do is to use some probiotics or do some herbs that will actually heal the gut first. So we have a lot of gut damage from antibiotic usage, from our non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like bute and banamine, from our ulcer medications, from poor diet, from all sorts of issues that can damage the gut. So, and we've talked about those in some other webinars, and we will talk about those in future webinars. We'll do one that's just on the gut. So as you're selecting sort of an herbal formula, and I'm going to give you some simple herbs that you don't even need to know anything about an herbal formula, but as you're selecting an herbal formula, you want to know what the history is, know what's going on with the horse and what your goals are, and work at the level of knowledge that you have. There's a new book out called Equine, Herbal, and Energetics, and it's by Stacy Small and Andrea Baldwin. Equine, Herbal, Energetics. And that's a really nice book and a wonderful contribution to our knowledge. And that is a good book. Hilary Self from Hilton Herbs has a couple of books on the market as well. Modern Horse Herbal and a Veteran Horse one. And you can learn a lot about the herbs that are in there as you start to go down this path. One thing that we do have to be aware of with herbs is drug testing. Some of the herbs, especially the ones that have the salicylates, which are the same sort of things that are in aspirin, definitely test positive. And there are other herbs that can test positive if you're competing at a competition where they are going to drug test. So be very aware of this as you're starting to use herbs. The good companies are going to tell you if there are herbs in there, and they may very well say on their label, you know, use caution when competing or something like that, or they'll have information on their website whether it's safe to use in competition. Check with your drug testing body, and you have to be responsible for what goes into your horse. So that's a really important thing to be aware of. Herbs have enough compounds in them to test positive. Valerian is one that is targeted. Valerian is an herb that has some very unique compounds. Some of our other sedative herbs can also test positive. And we're going to see a lot of attention paid to learning how to test for different herbs. The problem is that a lot of these herbs grow out in the pasture. And so if they're growing in the pasture and the horse eats them, then there's not a whole lot you can do. So that's one of the reasons herbs are a little bit hard to test. But they are spending a lot of money and they are trying to catch everybody using herbs. Personally, I think that herbs are a whole lot safer than a lot of the drugs that they allow, but that's not for me to decide. The other thing before we get into the nuts and bolts of a few herbs to work with is garbage in equals garbage out. So poor quality ingredients are a complete waste of your money. And poorly formulated formulas by people who don't know a lot, I'll call some of them kitchen sink formulas. They have a little bit of everything that might possibly work. They usually end up not working very well. So you really want to work with companies and people that know what they're doing, or learn yourself and experiment along the way and pay attention, take notes, and really put an effort into it. You also want to get good quality herbs themselves. So we want people who are educated making formulas, but we want quality control in every batch of herbs. And if you're looking for like herbs in bulk at your health food store, those are probably fine, but they're probably not great. One company that sells a lot of really nice high quality bulk herbs is called Mountain Rose Herbals, and you can go online and you can order pounds of herbs if you want to. We also want to know that companies have harvested their herbs ethically. They're not over harvesting. There are a lot of herbs now that are actually endangered plants that we will probably lose if people don't harvest them properly. Good companies are going to divulge their sources, and they're going to have a freshness date of some sort. So now let's do the fun part, which is looking at the actual herbs. Lots of people have heard of milk thistle. You probably don't realize all the things that milk thistle can do. We usually use the seeds, and actually if you're in certain parts of the country and up in Canada, milk thistle can be an invasive plant. So you may need to use ground up seeds that would not be active. And that's worth checking out for the certain parts of the country, particularly out west and up north. It's known for its protection of the liver. It's very soothing to liver tissue. It's very soothing to the digestive tract. We call it demulcent. There's all these good herbal words that you can learn. And but you don't have to worry about those and understanding all the herbal terminology to understand how these things work. But I've put them in there to begin to educate people. So it stimulates bile production, it corrects the liver function, and it protects the liver from drug damage. So if you have a horse that has to be on some kind of drugs, adding some milk thistle can be a really good way to protect the liver. Milk thistle is very safe to use in the long term, and you need to use it for 4 to 6 weeks at least before you're going to see major noticeable results. It's useful in the digestive tract, even with ulcers. It is actually, a lot of research goes into it for insulin resistance and glucose metabolism. One of the companies that uses it in their digestive support is one of my favorite companies, is Hilton Herbs. They have their digest support. They add milk thistle to it because it's really good in the gut. And the gut and the liver are actually very closely connected. But milk thistle can also be good for the immune system. They're even using it in cancer patients. If you type into the computer milk thistle research and you look at some of the scientific research on milk thistle, you can read about it for the next year. It's amazing how much research there actually is. Ginger is another great herb to have around, and the interesting thing is most of us have some ginger in our spice cupboard, and you'll see why that's a useful thing in a minute. We usually use the ginger root, which is called a rhizome also, and you can make a tea out of it, you can make a tincture out of it, and you can also use up the ground root just like it comes out of your spice cupboard. It's a warming herb. We generally think of ginger in the winter time, and it's used to treat colds and flus. And you can use that as a supplement if your horse has an influenza or upper respiratory infection of some sort. Ginger can be a very nice herb to add to it. It's got a lot of research about its use in the immune system. It's also a big one used to treat many digestive disorders. So if you are stuck at home or stuck somewhere where there's some ginger and your horse starts to have a colic, you can get some ginger, make a tea out of it, and drench your horse with some ginger before the vet gets there. And that may very well help you solve a mild colic situation. It's not going to turn around a surgical colic, but many of our mild colics we actually can treat with things that we have in our own spice cupboard. The other thing that's really cool about ginger is that it's a powerful anti-nausea herb. It's used in chemotherapy for people because of its anti-nausea effects. And it is useful for travel sickness. Most people do not think of horses as having travel sickness. However, I firmly believe that horses have travel sickness. And I think the characteristic symptoms of it are horses that do not eat when they are in the trailer. They may sweat. They generally load fine. They don't mind getting on the trailer. The trailer's not the problem. It's the motion that's the problem. So I'll usually use a tablespoon or two starting about 30 minutes before trailer riding. And if it's a long ride, I'll use it during the trailer ride, maybe put it into a syringe or something if you've got a 3 or 4 hour ride. But if you're just going to a competition an hour or two away, Usually about 30 minutes before is fine. If your horse then starts eating while they're trailering and they aren't sweating and don't seem disturbed, then you know that you have solved the problem and you can continue to use that as long as you need to. You can give them the same dose before you load up to come home. In our old patients, it's also, we use it for the chemotherapy, as I said. In the old patients, it is really, really useful as an anti-arthritic herb. So for some of the old horses, we just put them on some ginger in the winter time. And you use your tablespoon or 2 tablespoons twice a day. And that can get them through the winter feeling much better, unless there are horses that really get too hot. So we do have some horses, some of our older horses, some of our Cushing's type of horses that get too hot and sweat. Ginger would not be an herb to use there. Turmeric we hear a lot about these days, and turmeric is sort of not edging out, but it's right on par with milk thistle as far as an herb that has tons of research. It's anti-inflammatory, it's an antioxidant, it supports and protects the liver. It's easy to obtain and there's a lot of research. But what we do want to know about turmeric is that you usually have to have it well absorbed. It needs to be mixed with things like black pepper, or it needs to be it needs to be processed. And there are a number of companies that have processed it so that it's readily available. So I have on my website the Cure Ost from Novell Research, and that is a company that has made a really nice, easily available to the body. You can feed turmeric directly to the horses. It does have a pretty strong taste, but some horses know that it's good for them and they really like it. Dandelion is another really good herb. And what do horses want to eat every spring? They want to eat dandelions. Let them. And if your neighbors don't like the dandelions, take your horses over and let them eat the dandelions. They will eat the plant and the root. They'll actually dig into the dirt to eat the root. It's a diuretic. It's a mild laxative. It's a wonderful spring tonic, liver tonic. It has this diuretic action, but it's supported with the minerals that are in the herbs. So we give Lasix sometimes to horses, but Lasix as a drug just removes the fluid, but it does not replace the potassium, the magnesium, and the calcium, whereas the dandelion does. The research, there's tons of research on dandelion, and generally we use the root more as the digestive tonic and the leaf more for the edema, to replace Lasix or even eliminate the use of Lasix if you're working with racehorses or high performance horses that may be bleeders. So, but it's also just a great general spring tonic all by itself. Mullein is another plant that's a really cool plant. It's that weird looking, very tall plant with yellow flowers that's shown here in the picture that grows everywhere. It's easy to get. And it's called a demulcent. It's a mucilaginous plant. So if you get it wet, if you chew it, you can just take a leaf and chew on the leaf. It will get slimy. And that sliminess is what will be soothing to the digestive tract and to the respiratory tract. So if you have dry coughs, you can use mullein. If you have digestive upsets, mullein is a great plant. And it's also mildly diuretic, which just kind of helps clean the body out. So we use it for coughs, bronchitis, tracheitis. Sometimes it's actually indicated even when you have some severe hard coughing. You don't necessarily want to use it if you have a very moist cough, because mullein tends to be moistening and soothing. So we don't want to add more moisture to a cough. Ulcers in the intestinal tract, irritation of any sort, and you can even put it on any other inflamed mucosa in the mouth even. It can be soothing for mouth ulcers, anything like that. Echinacea, everybody has heard of. Generally, we use the roots of Echinacea. It's a really good antiviral, antibacterial, immunostimulant, and yet in many ways it's more of an immunomodulator. It regulates the immune system, it supports the immune system, it doesn't just stimulate it. We can use it in chronic infections, we can use it in acute infections, and we can use it preventatively. And some of the research goes both ways as far as, does it really work preventatively? I think it does. I think it can be very useful if you're going to go through a stressful, say you're going to ship horses halfway across the country. Echinacea can be a very useful thing as a prophylaxis. If you know that there's a respiratory infection going around the barn or around the neighborhood, there's no harm in putting the horses on it. They probably don't need to live on just Echinacea, but you can use some formulas that have Echinacea in it that are balanced to support the immune system, and some horses can live on those for a long time. Chamomile, probably the last herb that we'll cover tonight. And chamomile, everybody's got chamomile tea somewhere. And the chamomile tea has, it's mildly sedative. So I always call it sleepy time tea. So you can actually use it as a calming agent, but it has many other good properties. It's anti-inflammatory, promotes digestive function, and chamomile is another thing that if you have a colic, you can make a nice strong chamomile tea and dose your horse while you're waiting for the vet to arrive. So you can take some ginger and some chamomile from your spice cupboard and your tea cupboard, and you've got something right there to use that's a tool until your vet gets there. And you can also make a tea and use it for horses that have anxiety. So those are some herbs that are fun. They are easy to work with. You can use them by themselves. And now I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and take some questions. There's tons more herbs out there, so we don't have a chance to cover all of these now, but we'll cover more in future webinars. So all you have to do is type in your questions if you have any. Okay, we got some questions beginning to roll in. Is there good support for a 2-year-old with hives and a 3-year-old with warts? Hives can be treated usually not with a single herb. There are formulas for hives. I use a lot of homeopathics when treating hives, especially if they have recurrent hives. Things like milk thistle are a really good place to start when you have hives. When you have warts, you're usually looking for an immune system, sort of an immune system booster, though again, I usually use the homeopathics. The real simple homeopathic for warts is one called Thuja, Thuja, and that can be helpful. Next question, is chamomile okay to add to an everyday regimen? Yes, chamomile is perfectly safe. It's a very lovely, very gentle herb. Sometimes what you'll find is if you're using the same thing every day, especially if you're looking at it for calming, eventually the body gets used to it and accustomed to it, and it has perhaps a little bit less effect or a little bit less visible effect. If you're for digestive functions, yes, you can do it every day. If you are using it for calming, what you might find is you might use it for 3 weeks out of the month and then give them a break for a month. So question of, can we get a copy of the notes? Yes, we will be sending a link out to the entire webinar, and you'll get the slides and the notes. Is there a combination of herbs to assist with soft and spongy soles? I look at herbs for hoof quality. A lot of mineral, strong herbs that have a lot of minerals in them, things like nettles, can be very, very good for soft soles. That can be, I add a lot of minerals. Rush Creek Minerals is a product I have on the website that the horses can take for free choice, because a lot of our horses are deficient in many of the trace minerals and deficient in some of the regular minerals. So I will also look at some liver types of herbs. So milk thistle is a possibility, but that's not an easy one to just say, here's a formula that's going to fix your soft, spongy soles, because we're usually looking at a constitutional issue. Any other questions? If we don't have any other questions, I thank you all for coming, and look for an announcement of our next webinar. We'll kind of skip over the holiday weekend, and we will start back in September. Got one more question here. What herbs would you recommend starting with for insulin resistant and overweight horses? I would definitely start with some milk thistle. I would use some flax and hemp or chia seeds, because those are wonderful for insulin resistance. And with the chia seeds or the flax seed or hemp seeds, if you get those, all of those have the omega-3s, and those are with the insulin resistance, the omega-3s actually make the muscle cells permeable to insulin, and they are a key ingredient in correcting it. So your omega-3 fatty acids, your milk thistle, those are going to be some of your primary. Tumeric actually is very, very good added into that. A question about HYPP herbs. HYPP is not just a simple give a couple of herbs to. Those are more complicated cases that we work up, and we have to be a little bit careful with the herbs, because we've got to watch our mineral levels. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you next time. Take care.